Thank you. I've already talked too much, so I'll try to keep this short. First of all, I think the one thing that struck me as everyone was speaking is how what riches you have here. Terrific presentations, and I'll just take the prerogative of a professor and say you guys really ought to be proud of Candace, who is obviously doing great things.
Thank you.
Now, my observation is for you, Candace. You said something which I was embarrassed to not know. We know, and it's part of the headlines these days, that the largest provider of mental health services is the correctional system in this country. When you combine that with the notion that the second largest provider of reproductive health services is the same entity, that's kind of startling in a way that I hadn't thought about before. Somehow that fits into the story that we're talking about today.
Right, well, and I think it's also startling because we know that there's policies and reform that needs to be made about the prison system and the criminal justice system. But all of there are specific communities that are automatically going into this system, and which are just disproportionately people of color. So it's frightening that for these communities who especially may not have the social capital or who are impoverished, that the only care that they're going to get is in the prison system. We just need to start talking about that more. And what are those implications for society at large?
Well, I just loved this panel, and the one thing I really appreciated is how a similar topic you came at from such incredibly different angles, which is so thought-producing. One question that I was thinking about when Candace was speaking, so Tennille and James, you teach courses with names like Biomedical Ethics and Philosophy in Medical Ethics. I'm wondering what kind of intersectional analysis comes into those discussions with respect to, are there specific top discussions about gender issues relating to some of these things, or what the role is that race or ethnicity might play in some of these debates, or is there more of an effort to try to emphasize the science part, which part of where science like law gets its credibility is kind of bolstering this objectivity, or maybe not interjecting specific discussions of, for example, gender, race, and class.
Do you want to take the first stab with your second?
Sure. So, I mean, I think bioethics, biomedical ethics is so big, it can be so many different things. So I have taught it, and you're just kind of going through the abortion, physician-assisted suicide, organ allocation, and it's by and large what you're kind of teasing out of these tensions between autonomy and things like non-maleficence. But then I've also taught it where there was a lot of focus on gender and sexuality issues. Taught something in the fall. Professor Roski, one of the law faculty members here, came in and talked about LGBT issues, and in particular how stereotypes about LGBT couples get pushed onto children, and kind of in the best interest of the children end up kind of being the scapegoat for discriminating against these couples. So you can do it any number of different ways, but I find the latter, as I've kind of been doing it more and more, much more interesting.
Yeah, definitely concepts about distributive justice. So we definitely discuss race and sex. I try to have it bubble up from the students as much as possible, so it's not heavy for me. And the book that we use tends to focus at the end of the class is kind of looking back on healthcare access through the lens of distributive justice with sex and race and age as well, and disability. The problem with that, though, of course, is that it comes up in every one of these topics of access to cancer treatments, death and dying services, and so it's kind of funny to treat it as a standalone, so I try to bring it up occasionally, but it's great. It depends on the class. Sometimes the class is very engaged with that, maybe because they've taken Professor Roski's class or because they just have that consciousness about race or sex. So it's sometimes the different classes look very different in terms of how comfortable they are discussing those things, but I think it's important to see it through the lens of each topic and not as its own separate thing. I haven't found a good textbook that does that, though. If you have a recommendation, that would be great.
Okay, questions from the audience? Okay, there's a gentleman in the back.
Yes, I have
If you don't mind, we have a recording, so it'd be great if you could speak in the microphone.
Yes, I have a question for Ms. Gibson. The sterilization policies for population control in Puerto Rico, are those still in effect?
I would have to look at it. I think those sterilization policies stopped within the mid-1970s. But I think what I've heard from advocates in the Puerto Rican community is that there's still that they still have to grapple with what that meant, because a third of the women on that island were sterilized. And so I think that plays a huge role in terms of what they do in terms of family planning. But I would love to get back to you about that.
Thank you very much.
Deborah?
Third, wow.
Jesus, I know.
That last comment reminded me of a question that had bubbled up, which is we've had some discussion about how eugenics and racism are not the same thing. They can overlap, but they're not the same thing. And I was raised Catholic, and then moving to Utah, one of the things that immediately struck me was similarities. As a child, I was always apologizing for coming from a small family because we only had 3. And, the people across the street had 8, and my brother's best friend had 12 kids. I wonder if there isn't a religious prejudice, because both Catholics and Mormons have been subjected to religious prejudice in this country, and they're both known for very large families. And I don't know, maybe that's an aspect of it. And the Latino community is not completely
Catholic,
Catholic,
right.
but there's often a large Catholic population among the Latino population.
I think that's definitely an interesting point to look at, because in everything that I've looked at or have done through my work, that has not been brought up, but that is a good point to think about. And especially going back to the whole issue of racial discrimination, last night, our conversation at dinner, I'm like, well, I don't know, is if immigration policies are sort of are part of eugenic thinking, right? But we do know these policies disproportionately fall on a certain type of immigrant population. So just a lot of questions.
And a follow-up to it that Paul brought up in a conversation, which is, and you had mentioned the disproportionate representation of people of color in the prison population.
Right.
Isn't that a form of limiting reproductive choices? I mean,
Right.
Yes, there are conjugal visits, but they're not very common. And
Right.
for most prisoners, sex and therefore reproduction is not on the table.
Right.
And most of them are of childbearing age, the majority of women who are incarcerated.
I have a question, but I also wanted to see if anyone else in the audience. So what really struck me about the panel is I really thought Jim's sort of putting up, as a philosopher, was wonderful, sort of principles to sort of try to tease out and define, right, what is eugenics, which I don't think is actually an answerable question, but it's an interesting start. And you talked about discrimination and choice, and I think also implicit in your presentation was this sort of the line between state compulsory, violations of reproductive right and the private market, right? Because what's happening, it seems like, with the genetics of sex selection and inherited traits, et cetera, is in the private, either in the realm of delivery of medical care or in the market. And at first, my impulse is to say, well, yeah, that's right, that's the line, right? But I want to just hear from the panelists, what you think of that, or also from Professor Lombardo and others, because, we struggle with this in employment discrimination law, right? So if an employer has a preference for whites, is that suddenly not discrimination because it's not, the state isn't really directly involved in that kind of decision? And so I don't have an answer, but I have a question as to what role if it's completely a private decision, does that take it out of the realm of what we think of as a potentially eugenic, or, that's my question for the panel.
I mean, the way I think of it is about access and who controls access. So bans on something like sex selection, that's one way a government can say, no, we're not letting you access this. In the US, it's been described as the Wild West because it's kind of this free-for-all, but then there's other ways to control access, right? You can kind of say things like, well, we're not convinced that's a good enough argument. Why don't you try that clinic in LA? I think by having our current situation is, in some sense, more liberal than what's going on in Europe, but it controls access in another way. Yeah, and so for me, it's the kind of what made eugenics especially frightening, as well as those other issues, was how access was controlled and who did the controlling.
Right.
And that still is playing out.
I think the flip side of the free market, the kind of ideals of the libertarian free market, is that if it's not in some way regulated in terms of access, if you put it completely on the providers and the institutions to decide whether they will provide these services and what you have to demonstrate in order to have access, you can end up having something that might as well be illegal, because providers won't be, if you're not married in Utah, you can't pursue certain reproductive things that are completely legal, but there's just not an institution here that will do it. So I think that's the concern, I guess. It's not the one you automatically think of. When you think of a free market, you think about it being competition and choice and equal access for the person who can pay, but that's not the case in reproductive areas where, because of the moral piece that in a conservative state like Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, there are many, many states where you just don't have access to things that are legal.
And there's limited supply.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
I think it's a great question, and I think that it forces me to say something impertinent again, which is that the fantasy that we have that there is a division between public and private in this country and that you can somehow talk about the market and that's different from what goes on is nonsense. There have been a couple books that came out recently that I think are useful for thinking about that. One is Mark Hall has done a book essentially demonstrating, and I think a very solid way, as most of his work does, that the healthcare system, such as it is in this country, is a creation of the government. And as I tell my students in healthcare law when they start on the first day, I want to be a doctor. What do I have to do? I have to get a license from the state. That's what I have to do. Otherwise, I'm not a doctor. Jim Moore, a fine medical historian, has written a book about Dent versus West Virginia, kind of forgotten case, which turns on the first time the Supreme Court had to deal with whether states had the right to license physicians. And I think if we have to go back and remember that the professions that we exercise are state creations. And most of what goes on in healthcare is done in hospitals paid for by the state, by people trained with money paid for by the state, and people who have licenses given by the state. And if you want 500 more pages of that, read Mark Hall's book.
That's a good point. It's kind of a myth of the free market, like that idea.
Other questions, comments? Yes, Professor Kassam.
Well, another thing that struck me kind of on this panel when we're looking at related type issues, it seems to me like the people who would have access to going to somewhere because they wanted a certain sex selection decision, as well as people who might have even access to the kind of testing that you were talking about, has a real class aspect to it. And
Absolutely.
so kind of some of the things that we've been talking about is where the eugenics debate kind of is now. I mean, historically, I think that a lot of the places where bad law was made might have been very different if you had plaintiffs, not across the board, but people with more financial wherewithal. And it just seems like for so many people, their issues of reproductive justice would be getting prenatal health care. It would be kind of a different conversation. So I'm just wondering kind of if there are similar like eugenic type issues now that would not seem like they were kind of, that were addressed to more of the same, the Spittler, the Lindas of the world than maybe some of the people who, like, even the couple that you put up there when they're like talking about those kind of issues. I'm like, there's just a whole large part of the population that wouldn't even,
Right.
have any access whatsoever, or even knowledge that that would be.
An
Right.
option.
Know it's
An
possible,
option.
know where to go to get it.
Yeah,
or-
exactly.
Right. I think that's right.
And kind of does that, do these conversations at all take away from those other kinds of conversations about just, access to prenatal care generally?
I think so. I mean, there's a very sticky trope in U.S. society of this idea of the people looking for designer babies. And it is, I mean, you do a cross-section of the marketing and of the people who have at least been represented in cases that bubble up to be published in appellate opinions. They are higher educated, mostly white couples. And so it does seem like a draw towards that. Creating a designer baby and the ethics of that does ignore a larger societal problem of just access to reproductive care. Maybe it's just because it's sexier, I don't know. But I think that's absolutely right. It might distract some attention away from more ordinary but more global problems. And you do see that even this is an international market, so the Fertility Institutes in California says, I think they do several sex selection IVF procedures every week for people who don't live in the United States, because we are the Wild West and it's a free market here, and it's not in many, it's criminal in many countries. So that's also a very special slice of the population, very, very wealthy people who could get the visa and travel here just for that purpose. So I think it can reify some of the class concerns for sure, of the people who would know to take advantage of these, know where to go to have it done. I think it definitely could be exacerbating race and social discrimination.
Yeah, so I should personally say, when I was thinking about doing this on sex selection, I was really torn, because on the one hand I thought it's really interesting, but on the other hand I thought, but it's hard to sympathize with this rich couple who can't get the boy, right? I mean, it's kind of like the stakes aren't nearly as high as a young girl being sterilized without her knowledge or consent. So I didn't want to introduce it as a case of, here's some other people we should feel really, really bad for, right? I thought it was, the play would not be nearly as kind of, it wouldn't be a tearjerker, right, to stump this. But rather, I introduced it as, I think it's an interesting case to put next to these to show how this term modern eugenics has been deployed in a variety of different ways. And then the other thing was just that there's different things that we can think of that were bad about the old eugenics. And I think what makes sex selection not so much prohibitions on it bad, but what makes it a controversial issue is precisely that what concerned us about eugenics in the past is kind of pulling us in opposite directions about this current case.
There's another question in the audience.
This is for Professor Taberi. Professor Taberi, the sinister notion of and motive of racial superiority, I'm sure, has come into play in past eugenics, and I'm sure in modern eugenics. Do we have any documented cases of this? And if not, is that because the subject is so taboo that it's never been looked into?
Well, I mean, historically, Dr. Lombardo's the go-to person on that. But I think what makes it difficult to deal with, in some sense, the history of eugenics is the history of legislation, like the Immigration Restriction Act, and judicial rulings like Buck v. Bell or Stumped. Those get a lot of attention because they're easy to track and we can overrule them and change our minds on them. But I think the other history of eugenics is the social pressures to do things like have certain races get sterilized or have abortions, or lack of social support, which is what we also heard about. I think it's more difficult to track because there aren't anti-miscegenation laws anymore, right? It's more social pressures that prevent this from happening. There aren't sterilization laws anymore. It's gone subversive. So I think, it's out there, but it's just, I think Candace is actually better to talk about this than I am. It's difficult to kind of do the research because you can't, interview the doctor that says, I'd be happy to talk to you about all the people I'm sterilizing.
Yeah. No, and I completely agree. I think it's just more underground. I think it's tackling more just these social and cultural thoughts that we have that we just haven't really talked about, right? Like, why does this doctor think that poor people should not have children? We haven't had those conversations. And then also, I think in response to Kristen's question about sex selection, I know from working at Latino Institute for Reproductive Health and also the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, they've also been tracking sort of these sex selection bills as well. And their angle from it is, this legislation is just a solution in search of a problem, right? Most of these women, this legislation is targeting very specific racial and ethnic communities. Most of these, there isn't data anyway
Right.
suggesting that these women are going in for
Looking for it.
an abortion because of
Sex or race.
sex or race, or for cultural reasons. So
I did think, I'll just add, so on Prenda, Neil mentioned it, and we got it there as well. Prenda was the closest we've seen to explicit bill passed to prevent sex selection. What was interesting was, when the critics came out to attack it, they were attacking it because they were saying this is just a kind of backdoor way to limit abortions. But they would also simultaneously say, but just to be clear, we don't think sex selection's okay, right? That's not okay. We just don't like you limiting, trying to limit abortions. So it was kind of like this. Yeah, they weren't willing to kind of just say, you can get an abortion for whatever reason you want, right? And if it's sex selection, that's your business.
I think, kind of following up on Candace's point, this idea of you have legal fixes like informed consent, which you hope would stop things like what happened in the Stump case from happening again. But it doesn't work that way because it's a human being who could bring the authority of the white coat or whatever power dynamic is brought, and then suggesting or highly suggesting certain outcomes. Here's the informed consent, you get to sign it, but this is my view or this is my guidance. And you speak to physicians about consenting, as they use it as a verb, and it's possible for them to be very directive. And so you could see that being another problem with certain communities who may not trust physicians or may trust them too much.
Even though it's not written down.
Even if it's not written down, it would be
Yeah.
totally legal, they've consented, they've signed the form, but they maybe were pushed or nudged in one direction.
Coerced.
Yeah, or flat out coerced.
I have one, is there another question? I have a question for Professor Smith. I was wondering if you could speak to sort of, if there's any sort of debate or developing ideas in the disability rights community. Because I've heard, arguments on both sides, particularly with regard to parents who want their children to have robust and full, sex lives and intimacy, and their children who it would be dangerous for them to have children, and so they want to get the ability to have their children sterilized. But then on the other side, there's the autonomy issue of the child and your whole talk. So I was curious if there are any.
So I don't know if I'm qualified to speak to debates within the disability community, but certainly when we say somebody is a person with a disability, this is a wide range of people, okay?
Yes.
Let's take our very low functioning, say 20, 30 IQ, cognitively impaired woman who is living in a supported environment and perhaps subject to the risk of pregnancy and rape. She's never going to form a mature relationship with someone because of her functional level. And so having children that she could raise is just not going to be possible. And some would argue that it would be better to have her sterilized to avoid just simply menstruation on a monthly basis, as well as the possibility of pregnancy should anyone take advantage of her. Now, obviously, it would be better to have her in a situation where no one's going to be able to rape her. But oftentimes, parents are looking out to protect and make the lives of their children as comfortable as possible. So certainly there are lots of parents that want more control over their children than perhaps they need, but there's certainly situations where an adult child probably would be better off, isn't cognitively capable of making a decision for themselves, but there should be some process to allow a guardian or a court to say, yes, in this situation, for these medical reasons. I think Professor Tabry was sharing or was it yourself sharing a case? Yes, it was Paul that was sharing a case of someone with a medical condition that would have been adversely affected if there was pregnancy. So certainly, it's a tough balancing act. That said, there are many parents of children with disabilities who have a difficult time doing the job of a parent, which is to encourage independence and to help launch the child independently. Often, you're inspired to be overprotective throughout the child's life and never really want them to leave home or grow up or be independent. So parents can err in the side of thinking my child should be protected when really their child could be more independent. Hope that answers
Yes,
the inquiry.
thank you. Other questions? Okay, right here. This is Colin.
So, what concerns me is that this is probably still going on. You mentioned 2006 to 2010 allegations in California. In 91 in Tulare County, a judge ordered Norplant as a condition of a woman's parole.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple, I still get emails from recruiters seeking OB-GYN services. Just a couple weeks ago, I got an email from a recruiter who was looking for somebody who would provide contraceptive services at a correctional facility in Tulare County, California.
Did it say what kind of
Did it say?
contraceptive services?
No. But I'm kind of tempted to respond just to see.
What did you have?
See, it was
Colin is an OBGYN and a law student for everyone.
And then also what is incredibly disturbing is that somebody in a healthcare provider would be willing to impose upon an individual's autonomy to sterilize somebody without their understanding or consent. I don't know how.
Would you see that as a clinical decision? I mean, they're working in a prison system, they're an MD, they're putting that imprimatur of medical authority, but it's outside of a medical setting.
Well, I know it's an outside of a medical setting, and that's perhaps just an intellectual excuse to allow that physician to sleep at night. But still, nobody is if I were, in theory, in that physician's position, the state would not be forcing me to sterilize somebody without their understanding or against their will. I don't know how I could resolve that transgression ethically.
One thing to keep in mind when even old eugenics, it wasn't always explicit in terms of, I'm going to sterilize this poor white trash. You got a little bit of that, but a lot of it was also best intentions. The thought is, there's another, I'm sure you could have written the play a different way, where the judge thought he was doing the best thing in her interest and was trying to prevent the birth of a child that would be harmed by growing up in this family. So, this kind of road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? I don't think these people are kind of wringing their hands, how can I, harm another person? It's much subtler than that. They're able to justify it as helping, how can I help this person? It sounds like pregnancy would be a real toll on her. Perhaps this is in her best interest.
I think that was the concern that I was trying to present with the more modern maternal screening test is the same problem was that they sometimes had charitable or at least superficially charitable reasons for doing this, either the individual's best interest or society's. And some of them were sinister, but I don't think all of them were. I think many of them really thought they were doing something good for society based on contemporary science or the scientists with whom they were consulting. So I think that's the lesson to learn from those 1920s, 1930 cases is that we don't always know what the best interest is from this kind of contemporary lens. And in the future, looking back, we may think we were doing something for the best interest of the child in a gay, in a same-sex couple, or in the best interest of a child of parents who were cognitively disabled. And I guess, it's the more looking back in the future, we may have gotten it wrong.
Okay, Well, thank you.
Thank
These
you.
were excellent, an excellent panel, and it did achieve, I think, our goal, which is to complicate the question of what is eugenic and does the state or any individual person define best interests. Okay. So I wanted to thank our guests. As you know, this symposium was a long time in planning, and getting a date was difficult. And we're just so happy our out-of-town speakers are here. And so, on behalf of the College of Law, we have a gift for you. I want to present and thank you for presenting here. So, Professor Calsum. Oh, I'm so sorry. So, Professor Tabry, thank you. This is a coffee table book of you. Oh, sorry. Well, I will. Too late now.
I thought it was a bicycle. You know it's a coffee table book.
Utah, Utah Wilderness, it's quite spectacular. So Professor Lombardo, thank you so much. And Professor Paulson. So this concludes our symposium, except for we will invite everyone to join us for lunch and continue the discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you.